I'll start by saying that I'm going to go off-road, I think, from the directions. I'm not going to talk about Montana wildlife particularly, and the reason is because there's 1.5 million species that have been described on planet Earth, maybe 9 million species that exist. In Montana, depending on what you call wildlife, there's tens of hundreds of thousands of wildlife species. And so we'd be here a really long time if I talked about the effects of climate change on all the wildlife species of Montana. And really, I don't think that's the right way to do it anyway. I think the better way to think about wildlife effects, climate effects on wildlife, is to think about the general principles and understand those general principles. And then from that, we can understand what we might expect to happen in any one particular place to any one particular species. So I tend to think about this question in a very global way, and I think it needs to be thought about that way. I have a great deal of confidence if asked the question, what will happen to wildlife under climate change? I'm 100% certain I have this right. Species will move, adapt, or die. That's it. That's the answer. And so the thing is that my thesis is going to be, in this short time, my thesis is going to be that we have spent a lot of time thinking about the moving part and thinking about the dying part, but I'm going to argue that we haven't thought very much about the adapt part, and that that's really important to think about for reasons that I hope to convince you of. We've been thinking about climate change a long time. This is the very first issue of the very first year of the Journal of the Ecological Society of America, and the very first issue has the top 2 articles are on climate change. And so we've been thinking about climate change a long time as scientists. So we've been thinking about climate, I would say, for a long time as scientists. So this doesn't hit us cold. But one of the impacts of having thought about this for so long as ecologists is that we're very aware of this idea that we know to be true, that climate drives species distribution and abundance. And so we do have this very strong confidence that as climate changes, if the climate drives species distribution and abundance of wild species, then it has to be true that changing that climate is going to change the character of the species that are found in a place. In other words, changing climate is going to lead to changing species distributions and abundance. There'll be winners and losers as this climate envelope changes. We also know, though, because we've thought about this for a really long time as ecologists, that animals are not static, that they're moving around on a landscape. And so movement can ameliorate the effects of climate, because animals especially, but plants also, of course, the wild organisms have amazing ways to disperse themselves. And so animals can move, and that can foster persistence of species. So, but because we've often come at this from an ecological framework, this is what we have spent our time thinking about. And they're both true. We definitely see range shifts. We've seen range shifts historically. We see a lot more range shifts happening now as these rapid changes in abiotic physical variables happen that folks already have talked about. We see species are responding, species of all types, from insects through birds and mammals. There is a lot of species range shifts moving to the north. This is just one example of many, many, many that can be given for birds, boundary range shifts. There's then also altitudinal range shifts. So this is a beautiful example from some naturalists that collected a ton of data, small mammal data, in the early 1900s. And so it was a very clean experiment to revisit those sites and find that in general mammal species are moving up, expanding upward, or contracting upward. So range shifts happen absolutely. Yeah, so most species are expanded from lower to higher, and contracted to higher. But what I want to emphasize is this question. Is it only move or die? Is movement the only alternative for species to persist in changing environmental conditions, whether it's climate change or any other environmental stressor? Or, alternatively, what's the potential for what we call adaptive rescue? So there's 2 ways that species can adapt. One we call, the jargon is we call phenotypic plasticity. I like to say it's just dealing with it. It's like I say to my teenage kids. Okay, it's not exactly the same thing, but I do say let's deal with it. But phenotypic plasticity, the idea with that is that animals, and we know animals are very good at this, plants are very good at this too, adjusting things like the body shape, physiology, diet, behaviors, that organisms have lots of tricks up their sleeve because they've dealt with variable environments over time. Animals have a lot of tricks up their sleeves to be able to use the variability they have, given the genotype that they have, to be able to adjust to change conditions. So that's one way of adaptation in the broad sense. The other way is the sort of classic Darwinian way, evolution by natural selection. So both of these things can lead to adaptive rescue. There has been what I'm going to call the evolution revolution, just because it's a nice rhyme. But the big point of this is that I would say 20, 30 years ago, people thought about evolution as being something that just happened to fossils. It was only relevant over deep geologic time. But one of the most important advances in biological science in the last 20 years is this realization that meaningful evolution, true evolutionary change, which has an impact on the phenotype, the form of the animal, can be surprisingly fast. What that means is that you can get meaningful adaptive changes through natural selection in ecological time. You don't have to wait till like the Cretaceous, or you don't have to wait till the dinosaur. It's not a dinosaur thing, it's an ecological time. Of course, the classic high school example that you remember is the example of the peppered moth, which is actually a good example where an environmental stressor, in this case pollutants, turning the trees black, changed the phenotype, a genetic-based change, evolutionary change, to select for darker moths. And when the trees were cleaned, after the air got cleaner, the moths evolved back towards whiter moths. Of course, Larson grabs this idea beautifully. When the monster came, Lola, like the peppered moth and the Arctic hare, remained motionless and undetected. Harold, of course, was immediately devoured. That pretty much tells it all. Move, adapt, or die. This is a beautiful example of rapid evolution that was done with guppies. The time interval here is amazing. These are meaningful phenotypic changes in color, life history changes, like when they reproduce, how big they reproduce, how many offspring they have, how smart are they about escaping predators, and how do they deal with predators. These again have a genetic basis. This particular example is not plasticity. This is actually evolutionary changes when guppies are either facing predation or not facing predation. Rapid, meaningful, phenotypic evolutionary change. Cane toads, a beautiful example, crazy things, terrible pest in Australia. But they have actually, I won't go through the example, what I just want to tell you is they've actually evolved longer legs to be able to spread more across Australia in a very rapid time. Steve Palumbi called humans the world's greatest evolutionary force. And of course, everybody knows about rapid evolution when you think about your ability to fight off bacterial diseases. That we know that antibiotic resistance and herbicide resistance, for example, those are evolutionary problems. That is rapid evolutionary change that's led to us to almost be losing antibiotics and to be losing most herbicides due to rapid evolutionary change. There is just no doubt it's rapid evolutionary change. But the good news is that understanding that has led to a lot of much increased ability to fix the problem. So understanding that evolution underlies antibiotic resistance and herbicide resistance to plant resistance to herbicides or pest resistance to pesticides, it lets you understand how do you turn around evolution to operate in your favor. Okay, so I've been thinking about this a long time with this critter. It's a snowshoe hare, and this question, which I'm not going to go into, we've been studying a long time, but it leads us to this question of, is this individual dead meat? Is this species going to go extinct? Or is this the template on which natural selection could act? And could this species, this individual, survive through plasticity? Could this species survive through evolutionary change? And I've been watching snowshoe hares a really long time. I've caught 10,000 snowshoe hares over my career, my students and I. And you can notice here they're very well matched. We're here in Montana. You guys know this, that hares turn from brown to white to match as camouflage. But over the years, I started seeing this more and more and more. And literally could see it as we had radio-collared animals with these white light bulbs hopping around on a brown background. And we actually saw more of this as the years went by, which matches completely with the rapid physical changes that you guys have been hearing about. So for about the last 7 years, I've been wondering a lot, thinking about what does this mean? Why is it happening? What does it mean? Hares aren't the only species. There's 21 species that change coat color. Some of the most beautiful species on Earth, like Arctic foxes, weasels. Here in Montana, we have 5 coat color changing species. So what does it mean? But coming back to the question from before, although precipitation is a bit ambivalent, not ambivalent is the duration of snow. The duration of snow is contracting everywhere in the northern hemisphere. It's very consistent. We're getting shorter and shorter days. Here in Montana, if you've lived here a while, you know that. You know that the snow has gotten shorter, the number of days of snow on the ground. I'm just going to say that we have found that hares have very little ability for plasticity. And that means that mismatch will increase. So here we just see in hare units, and by that way I should say, some of you might know Smead Collard. He's a young adult book writer, and he wrote a book about our work, and he has the best graphics I've ever used, so I'm borrowing his graphics. But this just shows that as time goes by, depending on the emission scenario, we would expect to see more and more weeks where white light bulb hares are hopping around on brown snowless backgrounds. This is assuming that there's no adaptation. We also know that mismatch kills. So hares that become more mismatched die more often. Not surprising, but it's a pretty drastic difference. And if you actually put this into a population model, you find that without adaptation, populations of hares that are currently increasing by quite a bit would be expected to be screaming declines by the end of the century because of the increased mismatch due to decreased snow duration. Okay, but here's the part I really want to mention, and that is that we can take those principles of evolution, just like we can with antibiotics and evolution of herbicide and pesticide resistance. We can take those principles of evolution and use them to our favor and understand that evolution happens most rapidly when populations are large, when populations are connected, and when stressors operate one at a time. This isn't theory. This is 100 years of biological fact shown every which way imaginable, field, lab, DNA, every which way. We know these things to be true. And so, also, by the way, these same characteristics, large, connected, and with decreased other stressors, also help with plasticity. And the example I always like to use of that is waterfowl, which the projections are that the ponds and the breeding in the Midwest, where most waterfowl need ponds in order to successfully breed, those are expected to dry up. But if we can allow for connectivity and reducing land going under the plow, then basically waterfowl can find other places to be able to breed, can find other potholes. So it's another place where doing these things for large, connected, and reducing other stressors can help increase plasticity, in this case, waterfowl finding alternative breeding areas. Okay, so I like to say there's things that we, the people, can do. Obviously, I'm not saying that any of this decreases the importance of decreasing carbon footprint and decreasing the ultimate causes of these climate changes that these guys have talked about. But what I am saying is, in the meantime, there are things that can be done to foster adaptation. And they're just doing one thing we could do is doing the things that I just talked about, to work to maintain large and connected populations and minimize other stressors. In some ways, this is what you might call old-fashioned conservation. People have done it, thought about that for ecological reasons, but the point that I'm really trying to push is that it also can be done for evolutionary reasons. We're We're not saying that evolution is a magic bullet that can fix any stressor that's thrown the way of wild animal populations. But it is possible to foster evolutionary change in positive ways, just like we try to foster it in negative ways with things like antibiotics. And I do have a link here. There's a little video, an 8-minute video I have that kind of tells this story for a symphony. It's kind of a fun project. So my last thing is just to say that when you look at this picture, it tells 1,000 words in one way, but also tells a complicated word, and it says with hard work that the science indicates that this animal is not necessarily dead, this species is not necessarily doomed. And so with that, I'll just end with some cute bunny pictures.